A 1320 WHCR in Waterbury. It is now 26 minutes after 12 o'clock, and Jerry Garcia is here. And Denise Merrill was to have been here, but she got caught up. Evidently, leadership is in the governor's office, we are told, meeting about campaign finance and the fixes that are going to be required there. But we're going to start in deference to Jerry coming in. Jerry Garcia is from New Haven, former alderman, running for Secretary of the State. And Jerry, I think it's fair to say that the people in this region may not know a lot about you. So tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll go into some of the issues affecting voting and the Secretary of the State's office.
You bet, Larry. Thank you for having me, and a warm hello to the great people of Waterbury. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Jerry Garcia. I'm a candidate for Secretary of the State. And yes, you heard it right, Jerry Garcia. A lot of people joke, they imagine the ties, or we got Gathering of the Vibes going on this weekend in Bridgeport. But I'm a Latino Jew who was raised in New Haven, Connecticut. Proud product of the New Haven Public Schools. I stayed around to go to college and went to Yale, and then worked in nonprofit and diversity education program. Actually, that's what a Puerto Rican Jew does, I guess, after you graduate college. I then went into banking and ran for the first time for city council, and I won, and I proudly served the 9th Ward of New Haven, the East Rock area. And while I was on the Board of Aldermen there, I sponsored Connecticut's first living wage legislation, got that passed, helped write it, and I also took on alcohol and tobacco advertising near schools with Dick Blumenthal, our Attorney General. And yeah, to give you an idea of how I think about the issues of voting, even back then, I sponsored a measure that would have tied future increases in the mayor's salary to increases in voter turnout, would you believe? Well, that didn't pass, but voter turnout is something that...
I read that.
Yeah.
What was the intent there? I mean, how do you tie the job that the mayor's doing to the number of people who come out and participate in an election?
Well, it's everything to do philosophically with how you approach this crisis in voting. And what we need to catch up with the more than 30 other states that have enacted early voting, and I want to be a champion for that as the next Secretary of the State. My mayor in a city of 124,000 manages a budget of $500 million. This past November 3rd, he was elected by the majority of exactly 11,289 votes cast. It's not a majority of that many people. That's the number of people who voted. You got 8,922 votes. It's 17.6% voter turnout.
17.6.
That's right. But you see, it's easy to point our fingers at the New Havens and the Waterburys.
No, Waterbury was about 23 or so. Yeah, it was terrible.
And statewide average this past November 3rd, everybody put together 36.4%.
And look at, even when we had Lieberman against Lamond.
That's right.
Arguably the most interesting race in the country that year, 43% of Democrats went out to vote. So what's going on here, Jerry?
Well, what's going on is again, we have secretaries of the state over time have actually risen to different occasions, and they've been reformers one way or another. You can look at the aftermath of Watergate, and you had Gloria Schaefer, who enacted Connecticut's first campaign finance reform. You can look at CCAG and Miles Rappaport as a product of that, and how he reformed the office. You look at Susan Bysowitz in the aftermath of hanging chads in Florida, and so the new voting machines that we've had. The logical progression of the Secretary of the State's office, its natural next step, I believe, is to join the more than 30 other states and enact a system of early voting. For example, I might shock you, and I'm sure I'll shock your listeners if I share that in Oregon, the state of Oregon, they do 100% of their voting by mail. There's no such thing as going to the firehouse, no such thing as going to the school, 100% by mail. And they are disappointed. They had a referendum earlier this year. They had really low voter turnout. They had only 62.5% participation.
What period of time do they give someone to vote with the mail? How long a period?
Typically, it's a matter of weeks. It's a couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, Denise Merrill is now with us. And Denise, thank you for joining us. We understand you were in the governor's office, so I guess there's a lot that's very timely. No, seriously, about campaign election, reform. And, you're going to be in special session on Friday. Jerry Garcia is here. And, this is an important issue for the Secretary of the State's office. What may be determined on Friday? We got a listener who called in saying that the threshold issue may be raised as opposed to a trigger, and of course people are concerned with money being so tight, whether in fact we're going to go from 3 million, 3.5 to 6 million or whatever. Is there any movement afoot to change the threshold?
Well, thanks, Larry, and I really apologize for being late. It was at a pretty critical point in that discussion, and that was exactly the topic we were talking about. And there was some feeling either way. I don't think we're probably going to get to a point where we actually do that. There is concern about the money and spending money. On the other hand, the recognition that the court made this decision in the middle of an election, it really does disadvantage the people who relied on the program. So, we don't really have any agreement on it right now, and I sort of suspect it won't happen.
Okay, but you're going into session on Friday.
Oh, yes, we have to do other things, such as repeal the sections that were declared to be unconstitutional. But in order to keep the program in place, which we feel very strongly about, and, to keep the special interest money out of politics and that sort of thing, we have to repeal the sections of the statute that were unconstitutional and also make sure that there's something called the severability clause, and we have to take that out so that if certain sections of the bill are declared unconstitutional, others can remain.
What about the access to the ballot for minor party candidates? That was something that Judge Underhill was concerned about. Doesn't seem as if that really ended up changing a whole lot in the appeal. Where do you both stand on that? Let me start with Jerry Garcia.
I believe that minor parties should have equal access. I believe that we should have uniform standards that all parties have to abide by.
Okay, and Denise, where do you stand on that?
I think it was upheld that our law, in terms of access to clean elections money, I think third parties have equal access to the ballot, but I think the question was really how you qualify to get this public money.
Right, and that's important to prosecuting a campaign, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a big distinction, honestly. It was upheld, and I think the sense of the court was that actually it has facilitated third-party candidates getting on the ballot. As a matter of fact, until the Clean Elections Program, they really didn't field many candidates, and now we've had several third-party candidates, so it has actually allowed access to the ballot in that sense. So it was upheld. I'm pretty sure it'll stand up.
Let me ask another important question, I think, to the people of this state. A lot of people feel that there's been a lot of gerrymandering of the districts here in Connecticut, and there is this issue of whether there should be an independent judicial commission that apportions, the way the voting is done district by district. We still have, I think, even with this law, 54 districts where a major party candidate is not running. Where do you both stand on whether it should be done through the political process or whether it should be done through an independent commission in terms of the establishment of state legislative races? Because, we want a legislature that's competitive. Let me start with Denise on this.
Yeah, I would actually like to see a system like that would take it out of the political process. And other states have done it. I know in Wisconsin they're talking about it right now. So I don't know if we could get it done. It's pretty hard to wrest political power from those who have it, but I think it would be a good idea.
Okay, Jerry?
Well, I think that speaks to part of what my candidacy represents. It represents the chance for an outsider to try and get into a system that is controlled by incumbents, whether they be Republican or Democrat. And in just the very issue that you raise is one where I think that the taxpayers of Connecticut and the people of Connecticut are crying for a real competitive opportunity to have their voices heard.
Okay, let me ask you about this whole rich man, poor man thing that's been going on this time in terms of access and all these challenges. Have we gotten too clever with some of these laws where now everybody's challenging them, spending a lot of time in court? Is it becoming more of a distraction than you were hoping that it would be when we implemented this? Are there ways to streamline this to make it easier for people? Because right now, is this exactly the type of election you imagine with either, millionaires or millionaires questioning why other millionaires are not spending money? I mean, what do you think about the process, the way you're seeing it unfold for the first time with statewide offices?
Well, I'll tell you, in my case, Larry, I'm thrilled to be a kid from New Haven who's had access to the kind of funding that I've needed to be able to run a statewide campaign. And, people used to joke at the beginning of these races that we had something like 75 different candidates for governor. Well, that's good democracy. It was actually great to have these many people crisscrossing the state discussing the possibility of being holding the highest elected office in the state. And so I I think that's a good thing. There's a natural weeding out of people, and that happens in every race. But the good thing is that everybody has had that chance, and it's testament to the fact that, you know, I'm one of two candidates who's going to be the nominee on August 10th of this year, and hoping to be the candidate on August 11th.
Okay, Denise Merrill, is this the way you imagined it being, with a lot of millionaires running around, and a lot of other people challenging other people as to whether they really should get this money? What do you think?
I'm not sure anybody could have predicted the amounts of money people are talking about. If you had told me even a year ago that someone would be spending $30, $40, $50 million to get elected, I would have called you a liar. It has never happened. And I don't know if it's just become sort of the new fad among rich people to run for office or what, because it's happening across the country, interestingly. But we do, as Jerry says, I think, have a plethora of candidates. It's great. I mean, it really has opened up the process, and I think that's what you're seeing. And that, combined with the fact that there was a big turnover in office holders. You know, the minute Chris Dodd decided not to run, a lot of other things happened, and all these offices opened up for the first time in a decade. So that probably contributes to the number of candidates as well.
Okay, if you'd like to join us, 203-757-1320. The Secretary of the State's office in contest with Jerry Garcia and Denise Merrill. Let me ask about Jerry Garcia. Before you came, we got the proceedings started, and he began talking about the ease of voting activities that are going on around the country, say mail-in, the opportunity like Oregon has. There are many ways to do this. There's motor voter, provisional ballots, issues of showing legal ID. How do you balance risk versus reward as we consider ways to open up the system to voters? And let me start with you, because Jerry did say something about this. Let me start with you, Denise.
Well, I think the fundamental premise should be voting should be easy. And, they don't call us the land of steady habits for nothing. Change is hard. And I do think we probably ought to be looking at some of these things across the country, basically because when you look at the data about it, it does increase voter participation in some cases. So, for example, in Maine and New Hampshire and the Oregon model that you mentioned, the no-excuse so-called absentee ballots, there is going to be a certain amount of risk. I mean, we have had problems with absentee ballot fraud in the past in some places in the state, but you still have to move over to a system where it's easier and recognizes the mobility of people. People don't live and work in the same town anymore. So I know we kind of cling to this notion that everybody should come in person and show up and shake the hand of the registrar, but I think we really need to move beyond that and see it as the right that it is. It's not a privilege to vote. It's a right.
Okay, what about even Saturday versus Tuesday elections? I mean, are you open to all kinds of different approaches to this? And just quickly on that one, Denise, where do you stand?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but, you have to remember these changes are going to be hard in Connecticut. Like I say, people don't want to change anything really, and it's very difficult, and you have to change the Constitution to do it. But I think we ought to be looking at all those things. But like I say, what I would look at is where's the evidence elsewhere that it actually has increased participation. Sometimes things that you think are going to increase participation really don't. And there have been several studies of all this, so I think I'd want to look in, the Pew Foundation, for example, does a lot of studies.
I've just got to interrupt. I'm sorry. This kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that's gotten our state into the mess that we're in. We have this circular logic in Hartford, sometimes a group think that says, hey, because we haven't tried this before, this is the way that things have got to be. I've talked to plenty of constitutional lawyers who are experts in the state of Connecticut constitutional law who tell me that no, it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. What we lack is somebody with the passion and commitment to actually make it a reality. This is something that will be the hallmark of my Secretary of the State's office. We need to bring it to Connecticut. We can't keep playing catch-up with so many other states.
Okay, let me just ask you about the office of the Secretary of the State. Jerry Farrell, who is going to be the Republican, contender, basically wants all of the public records in the state housed in the office of the Secretary of the State. From what I can tell, that office isn't quite ready to absorb that. What kind of 21st century changes do you want this office to make, and how much of the state's business do you want on file there, and how do you make that office easier for businesses who cannot even register online today for many things? How can they get access so we can step into the 21st century? Jerry Garcia.
Well, I bring an MBA to this office, and I'm from a top university, that Ivy League one in New Haven, and I'm a business person, a practitioner. I consult to small businesses, and I try to help them succeed. And I'm in the process right now now of working with a business that wants very much to move to Connecticut, but because of just how Byzantine the Hartford system is and has been allowed to be, we're not gaining the access that we need to the people that we need to make this move possible. How often do we have businesses banging on our door to come to Connecticut? So my vision for the office will be to be the one-stop shop that enables businesses to succeed, that provides the timely, actionable, and useful information to them proactively, rather than just being a place that kind of collects those checks so that they can register, a place that actually serves as their concierge and helps partner with them to navigate this system.
Okay. Denise Merrill, where do you stand on this?
Well, I would say something very similar. Actually, I've just introduced an online paperwork reduction thing for the whole state of Connecticut. Yes, all the public records probably should be at the state's office, but it should be proactive, and you should certainly be able to do all kinds of things online without having to come to Hartford. And I'm hearing that all over the state from people that try to interact with the office. But more than that, it could be an office of accountability and transparency for government records. You have to remember the reason we're doing all this registration of business to begin with is to provide access to the public, and it's really a consumer protection function in a way. But yes, there should be outreach, but there has to be somebody who recognizes the practical reality is we don't have a lot of money right now, so there's going to have to be a way to get some investment into that office so that we can upgrade their computer systems. That's the real problem.
Okay, let me start with you, Denise, going back to the voter issues. And this office, is a very important one as an educator and administrator of our function. And yet we find, and we began talking to Jerry Garcia about this before you came on the line, about voter turnout has been just horrendous in the state of Connecticut, despite the fact that Susan Beisowitz has been a very aggressive ambassador for voting. The question is, other countries, for example, have attempted mandatory voting with fines. Other states allow unaffiliated voters to vote in primaries so that you get maybe candidates who are more in the mainstream. What do you say about different kinds of approaches such as those here in the state of Connecticut?
Well, for example, the unaffiliated voters voting in primaries, I think it's a good idea. I think anything we can do to boost turnout is good. But I think, if you look at it, 2 years ago, 225,000 new people registered to vote, most of whom had never voted before. And it wasn't because we badgered them into it or made them do it. They were inspired to vote because they had someone they wanted to vote for. Now, we have to go out and keep those people involved. And it's mostly young people. They don't have the same sense that the, let's say, World War II generation did, that voting is something you absolutely have to do. And some of that is because it was not taught as well as it should be in the schools. I introduced a bill in Connecticut to require the teaching of civics as a point of graduation, and I think those kinds of things will help. We've got to reintroduce the new generation to voting and the importance and imperative of participating in public life.
Okay, so unaffiliated voters, yes. What about the idea of mandatory voting? They've just done it in Australia. What do you say to that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, they've had that in places like Austria for many years. It's always been like that. I don't think Americans react very well to this idea of requiring people to do things. I just don't see that as good citizenship. Good citizenship is someone who understands the importance of it and comes forward. And I just think we have to have enough public education and really do aggressive outreach in communities where, young people, minority communities where there hasn't been as much participation. It's a complex problem, but I think, really it's that outreach piece that I think you need to do.
Just, if I may, this is really remarkable. I mean, the majority leader's comments just don't match her record. And the state of Connecticut needs a new kind of leadership. They need the Secretary of the State's office to be engaged, somebody who actually wants to do the job of the office, who's not just capping off their career there, but actually has shown a history and a passion of reform. I mean, let's face it, the state's budget is going off a cliff. The majority leader, before being majority leader, was the chair of appropriations. She was in charge of taxpayer money, and every penny of it. And after being the chair of appropriations, became basically the chair of all the chairs. The head majority leader. The majority leader is the representative in charge of the entire Democratic General Assembly. And I find it very difficult to think of all the opportunities that the majority leader has had over this period of time to reform and to enact measures that would reform within the Secretary of the State's office, and then she hasn't done done it. I bring a fresh face, a fresh vision, a fresh perspective, and an actual drive to do the office. I believe that I'm the one candidate who's going to bring people out to vote who weren't already going to come out to vote. Because as I go to many of the centers around the state of Connecticut, people are really excited about the possibility of change and a new face and not the same old, same old.
Okay, Denise, how do you want to respond?
Well, I would say that I don't see a single thing in Jerry's record that shows that he's done anything on any of these things. He's saying he wants to do it. Saying it and actually doing it are two different things. I've been fighting on these issues for 15 years on all kinds of different issues. I've introduced several bills, including one of the first campaign finance reform bills in the state in 1995. And I've been fighting ever since, and we have made incremental progress, and we will continue to make progress. I think I'm the one that has the experience to be able to make it a reality, and that is a big thing.
Well, let's talk about that experience then, Madam Majority Leader. I mean, we need look no further than this week's piece. I'm sure you've seen it in the Norwich Bulletin. Ray Hackett says, Majority Leader is microcosm of irresponsibility. He says, Merrill, who's running for Secretary of the State, is the poster child of the Democratic leadership's irresponsible fiscal policies that have pushed this state down the road to financial ruin. He goes on to say that I expected her to dance around or avoid accountability of the state's fiscal mess. I was flabbergasted by her arrogance. I mean, this blows me away. Given the fact that she's served nearly 18 years in the General Assembly, 4 years, 4 years as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the committee that spends taxpayers' money, and the last 2 as Majority Leader, what recommendations she would offer, that's not my problem. I'm running for Secretary of the State. I'm out of there.
Okay, Denise, and I want to say this, that, the Secretary of the State's office has been a springboard for some people to governor, and of course, this idea that this was not your responsibility, it was George Bush's, when in fact even the endorsed candidate for the Democratic Party says it's a bipartisan mess, and he means Governor Merrill and the legislature. How do you explain those remarks?
I'm a Democrat, basically, and I understand that the Norwich Bulletin is coming from a conservative perspective that they wanted me to say, what programs are you going to cut to solve the budget crisis? First of all, no, I don't think that the Connecticut General Assembly is responsible for a global meltdown in the economy. We lost our revenue right over a cliff. January 15th, 2009, I know because I remember it happening. So we were patching things together, and I think we did a pretty good job because our priority, and my priority as a Democrat, is to save programs for families and to save jobs. That was our priority. We were not going to lay more people off. And so, frankly, I'm proud of the job we did in an extremely bad situation. And, I understand that the Norwich Bulletin and I probably don't agree on very much philosophically. But that is the perspective I have on this. And I come at that, I'll tell you, one quick story about my grandfather, who was laid off in 1935, like everybody else was in the Depression. And all growing up, all I heard about was how if the government hadn't stepped in with programs like the WPA and other programs, my family would have starved.
Okay, we have
time for people to remember that in this economy.
It's now 2010. And we need the kind of leadership, we need the kind of practitioners in office who actually know how to do the job of the office. We need people who have actual management experience, not talking about, what it's like to corral 114 Democrats. I'm a Democrat too, Madam Majority Leader, and we're from the same party, but we do see things very differently. And the Norwich Bulletin had what it had to say. We both went before that board, and they've said what they've had to say. I don't know who they'll endorse, but this piece speaks for itself. I'm running again, listeners. I'm running to do the job of Secretary of the State. I'm not running as somebody who's, wanting to be in Hartford for the next 20 years. I'm running because I believe that I'm uniquely capable to bring reform to that office, early voting, and a business focus.
Okay, I've got a couple of callers. I want to get to them, but Jerry Garcia, I want to ask you. There were some concerns about how you raised the last bit of your money to get yourself to the $375,000 public financing, and you're part of the New Haven machine. Kevin Rennie in his column, really put a question mark on some of those dollars. Tell us, how did people who were identified as unemployed give you $50 or $100? I mean, there were some concerns raised about this.
I'm just so honored that so many people reached so deep to participate. And frankly, we had such a great cross-section of people. It was a real grassroots effort. I take issue with being a product of the New Haven machine. I'm really not. In fact, we've seen people come together in Bridgeport and New Haven and other cities who don't typically work together, but because they believe that my candidacy is so important. I believe that all of these people are going to come out in large numbers, and these are the people who invested their hard-earned money in my campaign.
Okay, let me ask you a question that is really pertinent for both of you, because the Electoral College is an institution that we have had since the beginning of time, and Massachusetts voted to go with the national vote as opposed to the vote of the people of Massachusetts, thus bypassing the Electoral College. Denise, Merrill, where do you stand on this effort?
Yeah, I'm supportive of that effort for the national vote. I think we've seen some real problems with it over the last few years. It has been in place for quite a while, but not forever. So I was supportive of the effort on the national vote, and I think that really makes a lot more sense in a participatory situation as we have.
I think it makes no sense. There's no way that we can actually guarantee that other states abide by the rules. If the Constitution of this country needs to be changed, then the Constitution of this country should be changed, and a lawmaker like the majority leader should understand that.
Okay. Let me
agree on that one.
Okay, let me go to some callers who are waiting to talk to both of you. And watch out, because I know Ferris doesn't like the way the technology works and questions its validity. Ferris, how are you?
It's not, Larry, you're right, as always, and that's why you're number one. But it's not just that. It's the fact that the waste, fraud, and corruption that permeates our government institutions is nowhere more evident than in the voting system. So that rips out the heart of anyone who professes to do their privilege, responsibility, whatever it is, on voting day. The polls are worthless. They're infested with corruption, waste, and fraud the same way every other department of government is. Look at Bell, California. Bell, California rigged the voting system in such a way that these same vermin put their own selves in office through vote fraud to pay themselves $800,000 a year in one case.
Okay, but
the voting system in Connecticut is highly suspect, full of fraud, and the plan that we have is that we're going to try to cleanse these voting polls between now and the 11th so that the same thing doesn't happen, which actually happened in the last election, and that election was stolen.
Okay, how much do you trust the reliability of the new scanners and paper backup that we have? Jerry Garcia.
Well, one of the things that I think is essential is that we leverage technology for the benefit of the voters, and and even technology like the Pony Express, that was good enough for the United States Constitution. I think it's good enough for us in the Constitution state. That said, I go back to the example of Oregon, where 62.5% voted by mail, and it's so much harder to create fraud when you have so many more people actually participating. By making it easier and accessible, by breaking down these barriers, it makes it much harder to infuse fraud. I would only support voting systems, by the way, that include a paper trail. I like to joke on the campaign trail that we have our kids voting on American Idol every week and they vote by text, but that's not something I'd recommend for the state of Connecticut, frankly, because we need that paper trail so that we can recount and recount and recount again if necessary.
Okay, but what about Connecticut's system, which does have a paper trail? You feel pretty good about that in terms of its reliability?
I feel good about it, but a couple of things concern me. One, I'm concerned that the validation, that the machines themselves are programmed out of state. I'd like to see that brought in state. But yeah, I'm okay with the machines. I'm not okay with the turnout. The turnout is such an important factor that if we don't increase it, then one increment of fraud has a magnified effect.
Okay, Denise, where do you stand?
I would say something pretty similar, except that I am a little concerned about the integrity of the ballot in terms of these new technologies. There are still questions about even the paper ballot and where it goes after it gets spit out and whether it's really matching the electronic. There's no perfect system, obviously, but I was a little more comfortable with the old lever machines myself. But according to the new federal rules, we can't go back there. So I think we're doing as well as we can. We do have a paper paper ballot, the paper trail. But this is the most important function of this office, is to guarantee that people have some sort of trust in the system. And it's critical. And after, as the gentleman said, the election was sort of stolen, in my view, in 2000, we have to pay a lot more attention to this. So I think there are some systems we're looking at right now that would ensure the integrity of the paper ballots in the case of a recount, or even just to have them around afterwards. They're not really secured in a way that I think makes sense, and there's some improvements we could make.
Okay, let me go to Neil quickly. Neil, what do you have for us?
Madam Majority Leader, before the recession, the state of Connecticut had approximately $50 billion in liabilities and no way to pay for it. Now it's approximately $61 billion in liabilities and no way to pay for it. You're not taking any responsibility for this? You're blaming, I don't understand who you're blaming. Could you explain this to me, please?
Well, I think if you're talking about blame, I think we spend far too much time trying to figure out how to blame and not how to...
Wait, no. You're in charge. And the Speaker...
Well, wish I were, honestly. No one person is in charge.
No, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You're the Majority Leader. The Speaker of the House, who you work with, said, don't worry about it, things are going to get better. Okay, forget the word blame. You're taking no responsibility. Okay. Is that what you're telling me?
Let me just try to answer what I think you're asking, and that is about the increase in our liabilities, mostly pension fund health care benefits. That has happened because of the incredible increase in costs in the health care benefits. That's the big cost, and I frankly think it's bankrupting the entire country. We did have some ways to try to bring the cost down, which I think would go a long way toward fixing our liabilities. We had ways that we could bring the cost down by pooling for health care benefits and so forth. We couldn't get those through, but we tried. And the pension benefit, I think people have to understand that the recession has caused some of the problem.
Well, if you don't
the fund, can I just...
go right ahead.
Let me say this, okay?
Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to tell you that part of it is the fund dropped, just like everything else did, because it's all invested in the stock market. It can come back up again. It's pretty good right now. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. But we have tried to keep up with our inputs into the fund, and we do put lots in every year. We put less in last year because we simply felt we had to keep it afloat. It is not in jeopardy, as I think a lot of people have said it is. That being said, I think we should make some changes.
Okay.
To some of our...
Neil, I've got to run. I'm sorry. I mean, we've just had a very lively, interactive discussion. And, Jerry, I've got to go. Denise, thank you both. August 10th, the Secretary of the State. And I thank you both for being with us today here on WHCR.